Well, thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I'm pleased to rise this evening to express my support for Bill C-235. I've done that before at second reading. It's a bill that essentially, requires federal ministers to come together to consult with provinces and Indigenous peoples on a path forward for the prairies in order to green their economy, which I think is a laudable goal. In fact, it's a goal that I think Canada ought to have made more progress on by now. And I do think that we need to be acting with a sense of urgency. So while I would say that there are many more things that we need to do, I don't think it hurts at all to create a framework wherein some of the coordinating conversations that have to happen between various levels of government, including Indigenous governments, I think that's a step in the right direction. If we are going to get serious about facing the urgency of the climate crisis, though, we're going to have to get beyond talking about how to have conversations and what conversations we ought to have, and get talking about the very real projects that we need to undertake. Well, often in Canada, when we talk about energy projects, we're talking about particular oil and gas projects. So whether that's the development of a new, extractive oil sands development, or whether that's the building of a pipeline, what we need in Canada is for governments, because we're going to require public investment in the same way, incidentally, that the oil and gas industry, and particularly the oil sands in Alberta, required public investment, massive public investment in the 70s and 80s in order to make of that industry what it is. We need a comparable level of public investment in renewable energy now to set us up to be energy leaders in the future energy economy that is coming, whether some of us would wish it or not. And so that's why often New Democrats are quite upset to see massive public expenditure in the oil and gas sector. That's an established sector, one that has already benefited for decades from public investment of various kinds. And the opportunity cost of spending public dollars now on the oil and gas sector is real, because it means that we're not setting ourselves up to continue to be major players in an energy sector that is transforming. And we see international competitors already undertaking the work, not just to reduce their own emissions and green their economy, but to become experts in the building and maintenance of that very technology that is going to be the future basis of the global energy economy. Canadians should be at that table. Canadian workers should be developing that expertise. Canadian companies should be developing that expertise. And we won't be developing that expertise if we don't see government investment that's directed toward the energy sector being directed to renewable energy, as opposed to going back to the well, quite literally in this case, of the oil and gas sector. We also know that Canada, to the extent that we are going to continue to extract some amount of oil and gas well into the future, because it's not just used for cars, it's not just used for home heating, it's also used for plastics, it's an important manufacturing input. Canada has to ask itself the question, what is a sustainable level of extraction? And I believe that there is an answer for that, and we can work backwards from Canada's emissions commitments under the Paris Agreement and other international agreements where Canada has committed to lower its emissions, and we can talk about what a sustainable oil and gas sector looks like. It doesn't look like approving every project that the industry itself says is a good idea. And unfortunately, that has been the model. It doesn't look like when private sector actors make a major investment, as they did in the TMX pipeline, the government running out to bail them out and say, oh, we're so sorry your project didn't work out in Canada. That's all right. Canadian taxpayers will carry the load for you. No risk investing in Canada, because if you make a bad investment, we're here to bail you out. And it's particularly frustrating because when I talk about the role of a sustainable oil and gas sector in Canada, I think the focus really has to be not on just extracting more and more and more oil and gas, but getting more and more value out of the oil and gas that we do extract. And one of the ways to do that is to increase Canada's refining capacity. We've actually seen a significant diminishment of Canada's refining capacity, and often the argument is always, well, there isn't the money. There isn't the money to build a refinery. It would cost tens of billions of dollars to build a refinery in Canada. That's what the government says in response to those of us who would like to see more emphasis on a value-added oil and gas sector. And yet, what did they do? They found what ended up being an over $20 billion investment overnight for the TMX pipeline. So you can't tell me that money's not available. The problem is it's not available within the context of a strategic, future-looking framework. It's just available as a knee-jerk reaction to the oil and gas lobbyists when they come asking for money in Ottawa. That's not the way that public dollars ought to be invested in the energy economy. We saw it again in the last budget where the Liberals announced billions of dollars in new subsidies for carbon capture and storage. And the way the politics of that works is that the Liberals lay out tons of funds for the oil and gas sector, only be told by the Conservatives that they're not doing enough and that they don't get the oil and gas sector. So it's a pretty nice setup that the oil and gas sector has here in Ottawa. They have a subservient Liberal government and an official opposition that no matter how much money the Liberals pump into the oil and gas sector is going to say that they're not doing enough and they don't take oil and gas seriously. That works pretty nice for the industry. But it doesn't work out well for Canadian workers that are interested in having their children and their grandchildren be able to get meaningful employment in the energy industry as that changes.
Take his phone out of the... Thank you.
I'm sure it's Canadians watching at home calling with accolades, Madam Speaker.
for the bill. For the bill.
As long as you don't change your position.
Disturbing, this is for the interpreters, and I do ask you, all of you actually, not to put devices on top of your desks when you're speaking. Thank you.
My apologies, Madam Speaker. So, you know, often the way that the public debate kind of crystallizes is around these individual projects, whether it's, you know, the Northern Gateway Pipeline, the TMX Pipeline, Energy East, you name it. And that's because the industry itself already has access to vast amounts of capital, and so they're able to make the initial investment in order to raise hopes and excitement about these kinds of projects. What we need is access to capital for renewable projects. There was a great, you know, the Canada West Foundation is not known to be a typically NDP organization. I think it's fair to say, I'm looking for some nods from my Conservative colleagues over there. I think that's a fair claim. They have a great paper out on the potential for a Western power grid, something that I hope folks under this consultation framework that's proposed in C-235 will get serious in talking about. And that those same governments that come to the table under the auspices of the framework required by this bill will also put up capital in order to move ahead on that. There's some interesting findings that it could help lower energy costs. It can certainly help lower emissions. But what we need is capital behind these projects to show Canadians that these things are possible and to talk about the benefits of these things, not only from an environmental point of view, but from an economic point of view. And I believe that that is how the conversation around climate is actually going to change in Canada, as we create excitement around real projects in the same way that there is excitement around real pipeline projects. I'm a construction electrician. I understand that excitement. I know what it means to look to a big project as a source of work and income for your family, and I know that's true for so many Canadians out there. Renewable energy can be that same exciting source of potential future employment to support families, but we're always talking about it in the abstract because we haven't had people come together and mobilize the capital it would take and do the planning to show the path on individual projects. Now, I talked about one that I think makes a lot of sense for Western Canada. There are other parts in the country that you can look to, which of course I won't speak about because we're talking about Western Canada in the context of the bill. But I think that is how we shift public opinion and build the trust that has to be built with workers in order to effect a proper energy transition, is by talking about particular projects. So this bill doesn't do that, and I am disappointed that after 7 years of government, the Liberals have not acted with the appropriate sense of urgency, and they haven't built excitement around particular projects that can be meaningful sources of work for Canadian workers and also help us build the competency within Canada for those kinds of projects, competency that we can sell not only here in Canada but across the world, in the way that Manitoba Hydro once had a very successful division that was sought the world over in order to help build hydro projects across the world until the Tories sold it off for pennies on the dollar. But there are ways of developing that kind of expertise, and that has a real value for us, for Canada's reputation in the world, and also for Canadian workers. So that's where I hope to see the direction of government policy go. I think this at least creates some tables for conversations to happen. We're going to have to do a lot more than that, though, if we want to meet the real climate challenge that Canada and the planet is facing.